Imagine waking up one morning to find that every challenge in your life, every physical ailment, every moment filled with confusion and pain originates from a single chilling reality, one that is not even your fault. You notice that your shaking hands, your difficulty breathing, and your foggy thoughts all stem from choices made long before you existed. Your parents, obsessed with preserving pure bloodlines, have condemned you to a lifetime of hardship. You learn that your mother is also your cousin, your father your uncle, and your grandmother doubles as your great-aunt. The family tree does not expand. Instead, it coils like a twisted vine strangling itself. You are not the outcome of love, but the result of a meticulous breeding scheme designed to safeguard power and wealth without any concern for the human consequences. This is not fiction. It was the reality for many women throughout history who found themselves trapped in a web of inherited destiny they never consented to. Before we delve deeper into these overlooked tales of endurance and agony, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden aspects of history, please tap the like button and subscribe for similar content. Also, share in the comments where you are tuning in from. It amazes me that we are uncovering these ancient narratives together, connected through time and distance by our mutual curiosity about the past. To truly grasp these women's experiences, we must first comprehend the twisted reasoning behind their enduring suffering stretches across centuries. European royalty believed that uniting through blood relations would safeguard their divine authority to govern. They considered their noble blood fundamentally unlike that of ordinary people, seeing it as purer, more sacred, and even blessed by God Himself. This tradition was so widespread that by the 16th century, European royal houses had become an enormous intertwined network of cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and siblings producing heirs destined to rule empires. What they failed to realize was that they were creating a genetic catastrophe destined to reverberate through many generations. The Habsburg family from Austria and Spain mastered this art of self-inflicted ruin. Their family motto could have easily been, "Let others fight wars, you, joyful Austria, wed." Yet their unions were far from joyful. They were intentionally planned genetic disasters that resulted in some of history's most heartbreaking personalities. Our tale begins in Vienna in 1634, within the shadowy halls of the Hofburg Palace, where a child is born who will never experience a day free from suffering. Mary Anne of Austria enters life with the Habsburg curse already embedded in her DNA, the consequence of countless generations of cousin marriages. Her family tree is so twisted it resembles a noose. From her earliest recollections, Mary Anne knows she is not like the other children. While they run and play, she struggles to walk, her spine bending unnaturally and forcing her into a painful posture. A stooped posture makes it challenging for her to breathe properly, and her jaw sticks out so prominently that eating solid food becomes nearly impossible. The servants have to slice her meat into very small pieces, and even then, meals turn into tiresome ordeals of careful chewing and cautious swallowing. However, Mary Anne's physical difficulties fade in comparison to the mental anguish she endures while trying to understand why she suffers. She grows up surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, and in every painted face she notices reflections of her own deformities. There is an uncle with the identical protruding jaw and a grandmother exhibiting the same curved spine. With a painful clarity born only from her suffering, she realizes that she is not alone. She is simply the latest casualty in an unbroken chain of hereditary misfortune. The court doctors, with their outdated treatments and prayers, provide no help. They quietly gossip about the Habsburg curse but never reveal this to her directly. Instead, they speak in veiled terms about unknown illnesses and divine fate. No one openly admits the truth that everyone suspects, but no one dares mention aloud. Her pain is the direct consequence of her parents' and grandparents' fixation on preserving the purity of their bloodline. Mary Ann spends her days in shadowy chambers, with curtains drawn tightly, concealing her from the outside world and protecting it from her appearance. She teaches herself to read obsessively, her sharp intellect one of the few parts of her body that functions well. Within books, she discovers realms where family lineage does not dictate someone's value, where people marry for love rather than for family heritage, where children do not inherit the burdens of their ancestors deep within their very being. Yet reality intrudes without mercy. Court physicians examine her regularly, recording her deformities with sterile objectivity. They take precise measurements of the curvature in her spine, the jutting of her jaw, and the frailty in her limbs. She is transformed from a human being into a medical case, a living demonstration of what occurs when genetics falter. The loneliness she endures could be far worse than any physical suffering. Potential suitors, all relatives, shrink away when confronted with her condition. Negotiations for marriage start and end abruptly once her affliction becomes known. She remains unwed, not from choice but due to circumstances beyond her control. Even in a society where cousin marriages are customary, her severe deformities cannot be ignored. Mary Ann passes away at the young age of 32, her body finally giving way under the cumulative burden of genetic harm. Her death certificate lists multiple ailments, yet the true cause is left unsaid. She died because generations before her valued power over kindness, purity over empathy. From Austria, our tale shifts to Spain and, arguably, its most heartbreaking character, Joanna of Castile, known historically as Juana Loca or Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic rulers who expelled Jews and Muslims from their land and financed Columbus's expeditions, Joanna appeared destined for glory, but instead became a warning about the cost of guarding bloodlines. Mary Ann's extreme behavior did not show itself during her youth. She was intelligent and well-educated, speaking several languages fluently. However, the roots of her downfall were already embedded in her heritage. Her parents were cousins, members of the same closely linked network of European nobility that had been intermarrying for many generations. The earliest signs emerged after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. This marriage was arranged to reinforce political ties, but soon became a psychological struggle. Philip was unfaithful, cold, and manipulative. Mary Ann's reaction was an intense and consuming love that others misunderstood as madness. But was it truly insanity, or simply the natural reaction of a woman caught in an impossible predicament? Mary Ann had been brought up to believe that marriage was her highest purpose, and that bearing heirs was her sacred responsibility. When that marriage turned into a source of unending shame and suffering, her mind began to unravel under the strain. The true calamity started when Philip passed away suddenly in 1506. Her sorrow changed into something darker and more obsessive. She refused to permit his burial, traveling through Spain with his coffin and regularly opening it to kiss his decaying body. This disturbing image reveals a deeper reality about her state. She had been so isolated and deprived of sincere human affection that even death was unable to sever her bond to the one person who had shown her any attention, no matter how cruel he was. Meanwhile, her father Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, used her alleged insanity as a reason to imprison her for 46 years. Mary Ann spent her life confined within the royal convent of Santa Clara in Torillas, where conditions were dreadful. She was confined to dark, chilly rooms, provided with barely any food and denied basic cleanliness. Her attendants recalled that she sometimes went for weeks without washing, ripped her clothing into pieces, and screamed continuously for hours. Yet the vital question remains, was Mary Ann genuinely insane, or was she pushed to madness by the harsh realities around her? Contemporary scholars increasingly argue that her supposed madness served mostly as a political tool, an excuse to remove a rightful queen from power. Her extreme behavior can be interpreted as a natural reaction to enduring intense depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, worsened by many years of neglect and mistreatment. The genetic factor cannot be disregarded either, as Mary Ann's lineage reveals clear signs of mental health struggles like depression and anxiety, conditions that intensified with repeated familial intermarriage. Her great-great-grandmother experienced similar breakdowns, and her own daughter Catherine would later display severe depression as well. This pattern was evident to those willing to acknowledge it. Mary Ann passed away in the year 1555, still imprisoned and officially declared mad. Her death barely received attention, as she had been erased from public awareness long before, dismissed as a troublesome madwoman rather than recognized as a casualty of a ruthless political system. Preference for convenience above human well-being. Our next tale takes place within the splendid chambers of the Spanish palace, where a young girl named Mary Ann shoulders the burden of an empire within her fragile frame. Born in the year 1651, she is the offspring of Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria. Indeed, she is his niece, since by this era the Habsburg lineage had become so closely related that it was commonplace for uncles to wed their brothers' daughters without raising any eyebrows. Mary Ann's early years have been captured with remarkable precision by the artworks of Diego Velázquez, the official painter for the Spanish monarchy. Within these striking depictions, we encounter a child who ought to be enjoying simple play, but instead is adorned in intricate royal dresses. Her small visage already reveals subtle indicators of the genetic complications typical of the Habsburg dynasty. Observe Velázquez's portraits carefully, and you'll detect what the artist was too tactful to highlight boldly, yet too truthful to completely conceal. Mary Ann's lower jaw extends forward slightly, just enough to suggest the serious physical imperfections that would become more evident as she grew older. Her gaze carries a remote, almost absent expression indicative of developmental challenges. Even her childhood posture hints at the spinal difficulties common in her family. Nevertheless, the most heartbreaking element of Mary Ann's narrative is not her physical ailments, but the utter absence of control she has over her own destiny. From the moment she was born, every decision concerning her future was determined by others, seen by men, not as an individual, but as a political instrument. She is promised in marriage to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, while still a toddler. The engagement is hailed throughout Europe as a major diplomatic victory. Yet no one stops to consider what this means for the young girl at its center. Mary Ann grows up with the clear understanding that her sole purpose is to wed her uncle and bear heirs to preserve the Habsburg lineage. She receives the best education available to women of her era. She learns multiple languages, hones her skills in playing musical instruments, practices dancing, and studies painting. However, all these talents are seen only as ways to enhance her appeal as a bride for her uncle. The wedding takes place in the year 1666, when Mary Ann is just 15 years old. Leopold, aged 26, is old enough to be her father and is literally her father's brother. The marriage is marked by grand ceremonies and lively public celebrations. But for Mary Ann, it signals the conclusion of whatever childhood remained. The reality of her married life is hinted at in court records, but never explicitly detailed. Mary Ann is expected to conceive children immediately, despite her youth and delicate health. The amount of pressure placed upon her is overwhelming, since the survival of the Habsburg dynasty depends on her ability to give birth to healthy heirs. She does become pregnant several times, but the outcomes are heartbreaking. Her first child, a daughter, survives only a few months. Her second pregnancy also ends in sorrow. Pregnancy ends in miscarriage until she ultimately delivers a son who survives infancy. The sense of relief at court is unmistakable, until it becomes evident that the child has inherited the full range of Habsburg hereditary issues. Mary Ann Teresa herself grows weaker with every pregnancy. The mix of inbreeding-related health complications and the physical burden of constant childbirth severely damages her body. She experiences what modern medicine would identify as severe anemia, breathing difficulties, and possibly epilepsy. Court physicians carefully record her decline with clinical accuracy. They observe her worsening speech, frequent seizures, and inability to retain food. Yet they fail to link these signs to the obvious root cause: genetic harm resulting from generations of family intermarriage. Mary Ann Teresa passes away in 1673, only 6 years after her wedding, at the age of 21. Official documents cite fever as the reason for her death, but in truth, her body simply collapsed under the accumulated burden of inherited defects and physical strain. Her passing is mourned across the empire, but not for the true reasons. Courtiers and envoys grieve the loss of a potential heir, not the tragedy of a young woman whose life was given up to protect a bloodline already doomed beyond repair. Our story now leads us to the dazzling court of Versailles, where beneath the ornate ceremonies and grand architecture, a princess named Mary Ann of Austria, confronts the unseen burdens of her Habsburg lineage. Born in the year 6001, she is the offspring of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, an uncle-niece union that was not only accepted, but valued among the European nobility. Mary Ann's childhood in Madrid follows the usual pattern associated with royal intermarriage, resulting in noticeable difficulties. She develops slowly as a youngster, displaying the typical learning challenges common among many Habsburg heirs. Her jaw extends prominently, causing speech to be hard and eating to require great effort. More sorrowfully, she shows symptoms that today would be identified as severe anxiety and depression, conditions that turn her everyday life into an ongoing battle. In 1615, when she is only 14 years old, Mary Ann is wed to Louis XIII of France as part of a complicated political agreement. This union is intended to secure peace between Spain and France, two nations that had been locked in conflict for many years. Yet, what is overlooked is the emotional toll on Mary Ann herself. She is uprooted from all that is familiar and placed within a strange royal environment, where she must rapidly adjust to new customs, a foreign language, and a demanding new position as queen. At first, the French court greets her with grand festivities, but the truth of her circumstances soon emerges. Louis XIII proves to be a cold and distant spouse, showing little affection towards his young bride. He is struggling with his own psychological troubles, which modern experts suggest affected his behavior deeply. Mary Ann endured intense depression and possible attraction to the same sex during a period when such feelings were neither accepted nor discussed openly. Caught between two impossible roles as Queen of France, she faced enormous pressure to produce male heirs to secure the royal line. Yet her Habsburg lineage carried genetic issues that made healthy pregnancies extraordinarily challenging. Her first several pregnancies ended in miscarriage or newborn death, each loss deepening her sadness and anxiety. The court doctors, relying on the limited medical knowledge of their era, blamed Mary Ann for these tragedies. They subjected her to harsh and degrading procedures, including bloodletting, purging, and strange diet plans. They frequently examined her most private areas, searching for signs of what they termed faults in her femininity. No one suspected that the root cause might be her inheritance from generations of close relative marriages. As time passed without a surviving heir, her loneliness grew. She became the target of malicious court rumors claiming she was cursed, that divine will opposed the Spanish-French Union, and that France demanded a different queen. The mounting strain caused Mary Ann to develop symptoms that today would be diagnosed as severe fear of open spaces. She grew terrified of public appearances and often spent days secluded in her private chambers. Meanwhile, her relationship with Louis XIII worsened as both struggled under the weight of their impossible situation. As they hold each other accountable for their inability to have children, they gradually begin to lead essentially separate existences, coming together only when court formalities require it. Mary Ann seeks solace in her faith, spending long hours in prayer and developing an almost obsessive dedication to Catholic rituals. When the miracle finally arrives after 23 years of marriage, it almost seems too wonderful to be real. Mary Ann gives birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. This birth is celebrated all over France as a sign of divine blessing. Yet, for Mary Ann, it is both a victory and a source of fresh anxiety. She understands that her chief worth is tied to her ability to bear heirs, and now she must face the pressure of repeating this achievement. A second son, Philip, arrives 2 years later, securing the line of succession and finally easing some of Mary Ann's relentless stress. However, the physical and emotional damage from her years of hardship cannot be undone. Mary Ann remains a profoundly anxious and melancholy woman who finds little happiness even in her ultimate success as a mother. The later stages of her life are marked by worsening health problems, including digestive troubles, breathing difficulties, and what the court physicians label as melancholy episodes that confine her to bed for days at a time. Modern studies of her symptoms suggest she suffered from anxiety disorders and depression common in the Habsburg lineage, conditions intensified by the trauma of her early married life. Mary Ann passes away in 1666. Having survived her husband and witnessed her son rise to become one of Europe's most influential rulers, Mary Ann's true legacy is not the political triumph celebrated by history, but rather the personal toll of a system that viewed women merely as reproductive vessels and overlooked the genetic repercussions of intermarriages among royals. Although Marie Antoinette is best known for her part in the French Revolution, her life is intricately linked to the Habsburg tradition of close kin marriages and their consequences. Born in the year 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I Holy Roman Emperor. While their union was not as closely consanguineous as other Habsburg alliances, it nevertheless carried the inherited genetic traits accumulated from generations of cousin marriages. Marie Antoinette came to France in the year 1770 as a bride of 14 years old, bearing not only the political hopes tied to the Austrian-French alliance, but also the concealed burden of her Habsburg genetic heritage. Her famous likenesses, painted by artists such as Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, depict an elegant young woman, yet subtly expose family characteristics, like the slightly jutting lower lip and the pronounced jawline that grew more noticeable with each generation of inbreeding. However, Marie Antoinette's deepest challenges were not immediately apparent. Similar to many of her Habsburg relatives, she endured what court doctors termed female ailments, which included intense menstrual pain, frequent miscarriages, and other reproductive difficulties. What modern medicine would identify as hormonal imbalances, probably caused by hereditary factors, shaped Mary Anne's life and marriage to the future Louis XVI. Their union was troubled from the start, though not in the way rumors suggested. Both individuals were struggling with their own inherited conditions. Louis XVI exhibited signs of delayed development and social discomfort, which made intimate connection challenging. Meanwhile, Mary Anne suffered from anxiety and depression, afflictions that had affected women of the Habsburg family for many generations. The intense pressure to have an heir weighed heavily on them. For 7 years, the marriage remained unconsummated, fueling harsh gossip about both spouses. Court doctors frequently evaluated Mary Anne in search of physical explanations for the couple's inability to conceive, unaware that underlying psychological and possibly physical problems linked to their shared inbred background were the true cause. When Mary Anne eventually became pregnant, her struggles persisted. Her first pregnancy was filled with extreme morning sickness, panic episodes, and what contemporary physicians would classify as prenatal depression. Although her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, was born healthy, following pregnancies were marked by miscarriages and infant fatalities, inflicting profound emotional strain. The most heartbreaking part of Mary Anne's tale lies in how her hereditary issues intersected with the political disaster of the French Revolution. Her anxiety and depression, likely worsened by complications stemming from genetic inheritance, paint a tragic picture of personal suffering intertwined with historical turmoil. Hormonal imbalances made it challenging for Mary Anne to handle the intricate political turmoil unfolding around her. Her inclination toward impulsiveness and emotional volatility, traits that might have been tolerable in a calm political climate, became critical weaknesses as France plunged into revolution. Court witnesses observed her increasingly unpredictable behavior as the unrest intensified. She oscillated between episodes of heightened energy and profound gloom, unable to maintain the steady political reasoning that the crisis required. Contemporary scholars argue whether these mood fluctuations were solely reactions to the situation or indicative of deeper psychiatric issues commonly found in Habsburg lineage. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she most likely never voiced, illustrates how her adversaries exploited what might have been genetic mental health symptoms to depict her as insensible and disconnected. The true tragedy was not her indifference, but quite the reverse. She was burdened by the widespread suffering and lacked the mental resilience necessary to cope effectively during her imprisonment and trial. Mary Anne demonstrated extraordinary bravery, but also displayed signs of dissociative episodes known to affect other Habsburg women under intense pressure. Guards recorded moments of visible confusion, difficulty concentrating during questioning, and a tendency to withdraw inward when confronted with overwhelming stress. Her execution marked the end of this turbulent chapter. The year 1793 marked not only the end of a life, but also the conclusion of a genetic lineage that had influenced European history for centuries. In her final moments, Mary Anne reportedly demonstrated the dignity that had long been her defining quality, alongside the acceptance of someone who never fully grasped why her existence had been so challenging. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the Habsburg genetic misfortune, it is essential to consider not only individual women, but also entire generations devastated by the custom of inbreeding. The Spanish infantas from the late 17th and early 18th centuries provide perhaps the most intense instance of genetic disaster in the history of European royalty. These infantas were daughters and granddaughters of Charles II of Spain, himself so closely related on both sides of his family that his genetic coefficient, a measure reflecting the closeness of his parents' kinship, exceeded even that of offspring born to siblings. Charles II was impotent, suffered from epilepsy, and was possibly intellectually impaired, a tragic outcome of 16 generations of Habsburg inbreeding. However, Charles's sisters and female cousins, the Infantas, endured perhaps even greater hardships, as they were expected not only to marry, but also to bear children. Their stories resemble medical case studies, illustrating the impact of genetic isolation. Mary Ann Margarita, born in 1651, displayed severe developmental delays from a young age. Court documents portray a child who could not speak clearly until she was 7, struggled to walk, and exhibited signs of significant physical and cognitive challenges. Mary Ann displayed traits that today would likely be identified as autism spectrum disorders. Yet, she was still deemed suitable for marriage due to her royal lineage. Her sister, Mary Theresa, experienced distinct but equally sorrowful symptoms. The court doctors described her condition as falling sickness, almost certainly epilepsy. She also faced severe breathing difficulties that made climbing stairs a struggle. Her jaw was so misshapen that she could consume only liquid meals, and her back was curved to such an extent that she required support to remain seated. These sisters were raised in the Alcazar of Madrid, a palace that had transformed into a place more similar to a hospital than a royal home. Teams of doctors, surgeons, and priests cared for numerous royal children, all affected by different expressions of the same genetic disaster. The medical records from this era read as if taken from a textbook, detailing the consequences of close intermarriage in noble families: epilepsy, developmental delays, physical deformities, fragile immune systems, and mental health issues. Despite their ailments, these women were still expected to fulfill their royal duty by producing heirs. Arrangements for marriage went ahead even though they were clearly not fit for motherhood. European courts received comprehensive medical reports on their conditions, not out of compassion, but to evaluate their value as potential progenitors. Mary Margarita was ultimately wed to her cousin Leopold I, Holy. The Roman emperor, the same man who had been previously wed to Margaret Theresa, experienced a marriage filled with difficulties from the very start. Mary Ann Margarita's developmental challenges made it impossible for her to fulfill her marital responsibilities. Her physical ailments rendered consummation almost impossible to achieve. The mental agony caused by these circumstances cannot be overstated. These women grew up with the understanding that their worth depended solely on their ability to bear children. However, their inherited genetic conditions made giving birth to healthy offspring nearly unattainable. They lived in constant dread of pregnancy, fully aware that each conception threatened not only their own survival, but also brought the risk of having children even more afflicted than themselves. Court documents from that era expose the human suffering in heartbreaking terms. Correspondence among royal women reveals stories of miscarriages, infant fatalities, and the ever-present anxiety surrounding every pregnancy. They speak of newborns so severely malformed that survival beyond the womb was impossible, of babies who lived only a few days or weeks before succumbing to genetic disorders. The emotional toll was immense. Many of these women developed what modern psychiatry would classify as profound anxiety disorders, clinical depression, and post-traumatic stress. They withdrew from society, fearful of public appearances, burdened by shame over their physical conditions and perceived shortcomings as spouses and mothers. Perhaps, most sorrowfully, they often held themselves responsible for failing to produce healthy heirs. The genetic legacy was a cruel burden that deeply affected their lives. The scientific knowledge required to explain their condition would not emerge for several centuries, leading those affected to perceive their struggles as personal shortcomings or even divine punishment. This self-blame added an extra layer of suffering to lives already burdened by both physical and emotional torment. To truly comprehend these women's experiences, it is essential to explore the genetic science that sheds light on their afflictions. When closely related individuals reproduce, their offspring face a heightened risk of inheriting 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In a genetically diverse and healthy population, these damaging genes are usually concealed by healthy copies inherited from unrelated parents. However, when close relatives, such as cousins, marry each other repeatedly over multiple generations, as the Habsburgs did for centuries, harmful genes accumulate and intensify. Each generation becomes increasingly likely to exhibit genetic disorders that would normally remain hidden. This phenomenon, known as inbreeding depression, impacts not only physical traits, but also mental health, immune system functionality, and fertility. One of the most striking examples of this genetic buildup is the Habsburg jaw, medically referred to as mandibular prognathism. This characteristic grew more pronounced with every generation of intermarriage until it became so severe that some Habsburg descendants were unable to fully close their mouths or chew solid food properly. Yet, the visible deformities represented only the surface. Modern genetic studies indicate that the descendants of the Habsburg family also experienced higher rates of other health complications linked to this genetic inheritance. Epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, depression, and immune system weaknesses were common afflictions among royal women, many of which were likely autoimmune diseases caused by genetic damage. The fertility issues that troubled numerous Habsburg women can also be attributed to genetics. Consanguineous marriages raise the chances of genetic mismatches, making it harder to conceive and rendering pregnancies risky. The elevated instances of miscarriage and infant death within Habsburg lineages were not solely due to a lack of medical knowledge. They were the unavoidable consequence of genetic harm building up across generations. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, the mental health challenges faced by women such as Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette can be seen as genetic susceptibilities to psychiatric disorders triggered by external pressures. These women were not inherently insane, but genetically inclined to anxiety and depression, disorders that were worsened by the tremendous demands of their royal roles. What deepens the tragedy is how this cycle continued despite clear signs of its detrimental impact. Royal courts kept thorough records detailing the health issues that affected closely related bloodlines, yet marriages between cousins kept happening for political gain. Court doctors documented the physical and mental ailments of royal offspring in depth, but these medical accounts were dismissed and ignored. Rather than serving as warnings about genetic harm, the link between inbreeding and health issues was evident to anyone willing to acknowledge it. However, political and economic interests consistently outweighed concern for human well-being. The Catholic Church, which might have intervened by refusing to approve marriages between close relatives, instead granted dispensations that made even the most genetically risky unions acceptable both legally and religiously. The Church held the belief that royal lineages were divinely chosen, and that maintaining their purity was more crucial than alleviating human suffering. Even the women involved sometimes upheld this system, having been raised to believe that their royal blood made them superior to ordinary people. Some deliberately sought unions with their own kin to preserve what they regarded as their genetic legacy. They failed to realize that they were actively contributing to their own genetic decline. The most tragic part of this cycle is how each generation of women hoped their children would be different, somehow freed from the genetic afflictions that had plagued their families for many centuries. They endured pregnancy after pregnancy, many ending in miscarriage, holding on to the faint hope that the next child would be healthy. This genetic tragedy involving the Habsburg line reached its conclusion with Charles II of Spain when he died in the year 1700. The absence of heirs ignited the War of Spanish Succession. Charles II was so genetically impaired that he was unable to father children and might have had intellectual disabilities as well. This tragic outcome was the result of centuries of close relative marriages. His passing signified not only the conclusion of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, but also the emergence of a gradual awareness that royal inbreeding could not continue. Although marriages between cousins persisted among European monarchies, they became less frequent and involved more distant relatives as courts started recognizing the genetic dangers involved. The women whose experiences we have examined were victims of a system that prioritized political convenience above human well-being, valuing genetic purity more than genetic health. They endured suffering and death not due to personal faults or some divine punishment, but because their ancestors chose immediate political gain over the long-term effects on genetic viability. Their story is more than just a record of historical suffering. It is also the foundation of scientific insights gained from studying their conditions. Contemporary genetics owes a great deal to the sorrowful Habsburg case of inbreeding. Their agony has helped us comprehend how genes function and why maintaining genetic diversity is crucial for human health. While royal inbreeding on such a scale is mostly a relic of the past, the factors that cause these tragedies persist in other forms. Isolated populations worldwide still engage in cousin marriages, frequently experiencing similar genetic repercussions. This ongoing conflict highlights the delicate balance between cultural practices and genetic realities. The conflict between maintaining cultural customs and safeguarding genetic health continues to unfold in many situations today. More broadly, these accounts highlight the risks of treating individuals merely as tools for a goal, instead of respecting them as unique beings worthy of dignity and choice. The Habsburg women were reduced exclusively to their reproductive role, considered valuable only for their capacity to bear male descendants and continue family lines. Their personal needs, wishes, and well-being were subordinated to political aims. This objectification is not limited to historical royal courts. Throughout time and still now, women have often been confined to their ability to reproduce, with their value measured by their potential to bring children into the world for others' benefit. The Habsburg tragedy is a severe illustration of a repeating pattern that persists in different forms around the globe. As we conclude these sorrowful narratives, a difficult reality emerges. The agony experienced by these women inadvertently contributed to a different purpose than what their oppressors intended. Their suffering, recorded in legal and medical documents, became essential evidence for the advancement of contemporary genetics. Although the Habsburg genetic experiment was a nightmare for those involved, it offered science critical insights into the effects of close relative breeding. Our current knowledge of recessive genes, genetic variation, and hereditary disease patterns was shaped in part by examining the sorrowful results of royal cousin unions. This, however, cannot excuse their actions. This does not lessen or invalidate the horror of their experiences, but it shows that their suffering was not without purpose. The insights gained from examining their condition have helped avert similar disasters and enhanced our comprehension of human genetics. The women we have discussed, Mary Anne of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Teresa of Spain, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the often overlooked Spanish infantas, were genuine individuals who lived authentic lives filled with real anguish. They were not merely historical annotations or genetic examples. They were daughters, wives, mothers, and human beings, worthy of more than the destiny that genetics and politics forced upon them. Their stories remind us of the vital need to prioritize human well-being above political convenience, to acknowledge the individual dignity of every person regardless of social rank, and to recognize that even the most powerful organizations can cause immense suffering when basic human values are forgotten. Let us return to the moment of dreadful realization we envisioned earlier. Waking up to find that your entire existence has been dictated by choices made before you were born, by ancestors who prized bloodline purity over human welfare. For the women whose lives we have explored, this was not a fantasy, but a daily truth. They lived with the burden of knowing that their physical pain, mental torment, reproductive struggles, and social challenges were all shaped by forces beyond their control. The isolation all originated from a single cause: a genetic inheritance corrupted by countless generations of inbreeding they endured. It was not only their personal anguish, but also the burden of centuries filled with misguided choices made by those who ought to have known better. Yet, within their suffering lies an incredible testament to human strength. Despite the challenges they faced, many of these women discovered ways to affirm their humanity. Mary Anne became a scholar, finding intellectual liberty within the confines of a body that restricted her. Joanna held on to her passionate love even in the grip of madness. Margaret Teresa bore her pain with great dignity. Anna found comfort through faith. Marie Antoinette confronted death with remarkable bravery. Their experiences remind us that even amid the bleakest situations, the human spirit can still declare its value. Moreover, these stories serve as a powerful reminder of our duty to learn from their hardships so that our ambitions in politics, economics, or society never again justify the systematic destruction of human lives. The tragic practice of trying to preserve bloodlines in their purest form has finally come to an end, at least in its most extreme manifestations. Nevertheless, the memory of these women and what they endured remains alive, standing as proof of the cost of prioritizing ideology over humanity, tradition over kindness, and power over love. Ultimately, their heritage is both sorrowful and uplifting. Sorrowful because their pain could have been avoided. Uplifting because their tales have contributed to preventing such systematic suffering from repeating. The pursuit of genetic destruction will never be justified again under the guise of royal purity. Those who suffered paid the highest price so that we might understand a lesson their forebears had failed to grasp. Human value cannot be determined by lineage. True nobility lies not in hereditary cleanliness, but in the bravery to accept our shared humanity. Though their voices were silenced by death and the passage of time, they still resonate throughout history with a clear and deep message. Remember us not for our royal ranks or political roles, but as individuals who deserved more than the grim destiny that genetics and power schemes imposed upon us. Hold our memory and learn from our pain, so that others might be protected from the burden of preserving pure bloodlines.